All right, good day everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Diagrams, Materials, and Methods. It is a panel discussion presented by the Rare Book School's Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography and the University of Houston School of Arts program in Art History. My name is Natalie Haran and I will be moderating the discussion today. I am Associate Professor and Program Chair of Art History at the University of Houston School of Art and the author of the recently published book, Fluxus Forms, Scores, Multiples, and the Eternal Network. Co-organizing the panel today is Elizabeth Bacon-Eager, Assistant Professor of Art History at Southern Methodist University, whom I'll introduce in more detail in a little bit. But first, we want to thank the Rare Book School and the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography for making this event possible, and especially the administrative support of Administrative Director Tess Slaminski. With RBS support, this program is being recorded and will also appear on the RBS's YouTube channel in a few days or weeks. And I'll post that link in the chat later on. And we also would like to thank the University of Houston School of Art for its support. So Elizabeth and I came to know one another's scholarship through our membership in the Society of Fellows, which is a consortium of humanities scholars drawn from a multitude of disciplines who all study material texts in their various forms. And Elizabeth and I immediately discovered our work's common investment in the history of diagrammatic representation. And it has been especially exciting for us to come into conversation around this topic from the different historical periods on which our work focuses. And so today we are excited to extend that conversation even further to learn from the additional brain trust of thinkers and makers who are also gathered with us here today, including Nydia Pineda de Avila, Trevor Stark, and Mimi Gelman. So simplified, schematic, abstract, diagrammatic representation offers an attenuated impression of the physical world, yet diagrams are themselves physical artifacts, manufactured objects with a material history that has informed their production, use, and interpretation. Today, we explore the tension between abstraction and materiality at the heart of every diagrammatic practice. A series of object-focused case studies from the early modern period to the present will ground our collective discussion today about the shifting material, visual, and semiotic qualities of diagrams drawn from differing contexts over time, as well as the consideration of available theoretical approaches for understanding diagrams and the epistemologies they capture. In our preparatory conversations, we considered now classic takes on the diagram, such as Bruno Latour's characterization of the diagram as an immutable mobile. And we will see in presentations like Eager's exactly how this category of knowledge production comes to materialize through pedagogical disciplines, like the one that she will present on. In Pineda de Avila's work, we will see how diagrams can be experimental tools used to materialize knowledge, reminding me at least of Frederick Sternfeldt's idea that diagrams are formal machines for thought experiments. In Stark's work, we will see a radical effort to dismantle and repurpose the rigid epistemologies that diagrams often represent. And finally, in Gelman's research and practice, we encounter a kind of decolonial development of diagrams that require alternative theories of reception. So each of the presenters will speak on a specific diagram or diagrams for about 7 minutes, after which we will reconvene for a group discussion. We invite throughout your questions and comments in the chat, which we will bring into the discussion when we get to the Q&A period. And I will introduce the speakers in the order that they will present, and then I will quickly hand it over to them. Let's see if I can advance my slide. Here we go. Y'all can see that okay? All right. Our first speaker, Elizabeth Bacon-Eager, is Assistant Professor of Art History at Southern Methodist University, where her teaching encompasses the history of early American art and material culture, architectural history, print history, and the global 19th century. She specializes in the transatlantic history of 18th and 19th century art and material culture, with a focus on intersections between art, science, and technology. And she is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Huntington Library, where she is completing her first book manuscript, The Technology of Drawing, Image and Industry in Early America, examining the tools, techniques, and materials of drawing practice in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The project charts the emergence of drawing as an essential technology of modern industry. Nydia Pineda de Avila is assistant professor in the Department of History and the Science Studies program at the University of California, San Diego, and is the Fletcher Jones Fellow at the Huntington Library. She has been an invited scholar at the John Carter Brown Library, where she co-curated the digital exhibition Constellations, Reimagining Celestial Histories in the Early Americas. Nydia works at the intersection of the history of science, history of the book, and visual studies, and her research broadly interrogates the gap between practice, theory, and representation in images of space and time in early modernity. She's completing a book manuscript that reveals the changing values of moon maps as visual experiments, technical instruments, and commodities in the early phases of the development of the telescope. And interdisciplinary collaboration is central to her research methodology. Trevor Stark is assistant professor of art history in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Calgary. He is the author of Total Expansion of the Letter, Avant-Garde Art and Language After Mallarmé. He completed his PhD at Harvard University, and he recently co-edited a special issue of Selva, a journal of the history of art, on reactionary art histories. And his current book, Research on Data and Social Rationalization, is funded by a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant. Last but not least, Mimi Gelman is an Ashkenazi Anishinaabe Métis visual artist, designer, and educator with a multi-streamed practice in architectural glass, drawing, and painting, and conceptual installation. Her family hails from Rat River Settlement, Manitoba, and she sits with the Medewewe Rattlesnake Clan. She is associate professor in the Faculty of Culture and Community at Emily Carr University. Her interdisciplinary work explores phenomenology and techniques of intuition through an embodied practice of walking and mapping, and through works and installations that point to the animacy and agency of objects. The cross-cultural dialogue exemplified in her work brings forward decolonial aesthetic perspectives and suggests a pre-existing connection to the other than human worlds. It is her cosmological orientation, her Ojibwe Métis worldview, and language that expresses it, that predisposes her to be open to the reality of the spirit and life of objects and their ability to communicate across diverse thresholds. She continues to exhibit internationally and was included in the seminal exhibition Online Drawing and Film at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2011. So without further ado, I would like to invite Elizabeth Eager to take over our Zoom stage. You're muted.
Perfect. Okay, now I can start. Okay, good morning, afternoon, or I guess maybe even evening, depending on your location in space and time. As Natalie said, my name is Elizabeth Eager, and I'd like to echo her warm welcome and thanks for joining us today. As both an organizer and a panelist for this event, I thought it might be useful to begin my remarks by kind of articulating the stakes of this panel for me, and in particular, the significance of the two M's, method and materiality, in our title. As a historian of early American art and science, my own scholarly methodology is built upon an investigation of the materials and methods of scientific practice in the past. I'm specifically interested in what might be called graphic epistemology, a way of thinking and knowing specifically conditioned by the practice of drawing. And as is the case for many scholars of kind of the field of visual epistemology more broadly, my thinking about this subject has been heavily influenced by Bruno Latour's seminal essay, Visualization and Cognition, first published in 1986 and then republished in 1990 as Drawing Things Together. And that feels a lot farther in the past now than it did when I started my graduate work. But I think the hold that this essay has on the field of visual epistemology is really quite strong. According to Google Scholar, this essay has been cited almost 6,000 times if you count both versions. And really, if there's a dominant theory of the diagram in contemporary scholarship, I would argue it is this. In this essay, Latour sets out to discover the specificity of our modern scientific culture, which is to say, the culture of scientific observation and experimentation practiced in the West since about the 17th century, looking for what he calls a quote unquote parsimonious explanation, one that requires no grand theories of the human mind or essentializing discourses on human behavior. Latour identifies graphic inscription as the key to understanding scientific practice, transforming inchoate experience into concrete evidence in the form of charts, tables, maps, and other images. Inscription renders scientific knowledge not only immutable, but mobile. That is to say, graphic inscription allows for knowledge to travel, to be compared, to be reproduced. It is the act that permits all other aspects of scientific practice to prosper. When I first encountered this essay in grad school, I remember finding its argument incredibly persuasive, not least because it tells the art historian exactly what she wants to hear, namely that the birth of modernity is not attributable to large-scale actors in some grand political or economic upheaval, but rather to the modest and unassuming presence of the image. As my scholarship has evolved, however, and predictably, I've developed a somewhat tortured relationship to this essay. And I thought it might be useful as a starting point for our conversation to draw out some of the key tensions I've found in my work sort of back and forth across this text. So among the many examples of inscription that Latour provides in support of his thesis is that of descriptive geometry, a system of graphic notation used to describe three-dimensional objects within the two-dimensional space of the page. Formalized by the French mathematician Gaspard Monge in the late 18th century, descriptive geometry came to serve as the centerpiece of the modern engineering education in the early 19th century. It thus figures prominently in my own research on drawing and the production of technical knowledge in early America. The methods of descriptive geometry are complicated and convoluted, but illustrated here in the diagram you see on the left, produced in the late 1810s by a cadet at the United States Military Academy at West Point. In this image, you see the way descriptive geometry's notational system divides the space of the page in two, each side representing a single plane of projection understood to be at a right angle to the other. So in this particular case, we have a horizontal plane that corresponds to the plan and a vertical plane that corresponds to the elevation of this decorative urn that we see pictured. Drawing back and forth across these two planes, one could rigorously define each point along a line, each line defining a surface, and so on, until the precise form and location of an object is fixed, both on the page and in space. While the tools for coordinating plan and elevation in this manner had existed since the Renaissance, the promise of descriptive geometry lay in its generality. The coordinate system of descriptive geometry provided a rigorously defined set of spatial parameters into which a variety of different formal problems could be inserted, thereby offering a powerful tool for both analysis and invention across multiple technical disciplines. In this way, descriptive geometry neatly fits Latour's definition of inscription as stable, yet mobile, scalable, reproducible, and subject to easy recombination. For these same reasons, descriptive geometry's progenitor, Gaspard Monge, hoped it might become the universal language of modern technology. In his first published text on the subject, Monge declared descriptive geometry necessary not only for the engineers who conceive a project, but also for those who must direct its execution and for those artists who must themselves execute its different parts. So sort of the idea man, the administrator, and also the laborer who actually produces a machine or device, building, etc. Monge understood descriptive geometry to be a means to uncover new truths. In his words, a way to pass from the known to the unknown. Such claims build upon those of earlier empiricists for whom scientific illustrations as iconic representations of the natural world seem to neatly sidestep the troubling arbitrariness of conventional language. As Anne Birmingham has argued, denying any, quote, gap between seeing and knowing, between optical truth and pictorial formula, end quote. Much of the literature on diagrams and the epistemic image has focused on the nature of that gap, on understanding the ways in which artists and scientists have minimized, justified, or explained away any discrepancy between the natural world and its representation. The great innovation of Latour's model is its ambivalence to such questions, turning attention to the way scientific arguments, and by extension their proponents, accrue power by accumulating evidence. Indeed, he argues that inscriptions do not matter in and of themselves, but only insofar as they are mobilized and accumulated, not just drawn, but drawn together. For him, the question is one of quantity rather than quality. And yet, the deeper I go into the history of diagrammatic representation, the more significant the quality of scientific evidence has started to appear. By this, I don't mean quality in terms of the fidelity of representation, or the degree of resemblance between the image and that which it purports to represent, but rather, I mean the material qualities of the diagram itself and a physical accounting of how those qualities have been constructed. For 19th century engineers in both Europe and the US, this question of how was exceptionally important. Indeed, for them, graphic representation was convincing precisely because it was a physical practice, measuring out on the page the intersection of lines, points, and planes offered a physical, concrete example of the sort of abstract principles that the engineer was attempting to prove. If we zoom in on one of the cadets' exercises, which you see in the middle of the slide, we see the evidence of that labor and that experimentation. We see the almost imperceptible variations in line weight that permit the form of the vase to emerge from the larger web of construction lines, the infinitesimal puddles of ink that mark the endpoints of a line and give extra emphasis to significant points of intersection, the recursive hatching that emphasizes certain lines and de-emphasizes others. These are the physical traces of the experimental process through which the geometrical proof is derived. To assist the draftsman in these endeavors, instruction and technical practices were bolstered by lessons in figure drawing and the application of ink wash, as you see on the right. The feedback between eye, hand, and page was understood to develop the draftsman's sense of taste, discernment, and keenness of observation. In the end, the physicality of drawing was preparation for the practice of a supposedly disinterested science. Given these conditions, I've come to believe it's impossible to understand the specificity of modern scientific culture without engaging the specificity of inscription itself. Ultimately, I find it curious that for someone so committed to a material explanation, Latour remains rather uninterested in questions of materiality. Attentive to the role of drawing in the agonistic field of social relations, he appears remarkably unconcerned with the agonistic process of drawing itself. While Latour continues to loom large over the field of visual epistemology, my ambition here is to begin a conversation about material and method, one that might ultimately start to destabilize the immutability of Latour's own immutable mobile. Thank you.
Welcome, Nydia. You can let me know whenever you want me to advance your slides.
Thanks. Can everybody see me? Can people see me? I can't see myself on the screen. Yes? Okay, great. So thanks, Elizabeth. And thank you very much, to both Elizabeth and Natalie for inviting me. I'm really delighted to continue this conversation on, I'm going to take a thread from what Elizabeth was just talking about, and that thread is process and particularity and materiality. So this is a three-dimensional diagram that I constructed with the visual artist Ale de la Puente in Baja California a year ago, the night, the day of a lunar eclipse, May 26, 2020. It is a three-dimensional diagram that was made to receive information during the lunar eclipse. So this is a diagram that's going to produce another diagram. Can we change slides, please? Next. So the idea comes from enacting 16th century cosmographical instructions that were drawn up by the Royal Cosmographer of Spain. These were instructions that circulated in the 1580s throughout the Spanish territories, especially to obtain information about longitude through lunar eclipses from Spanish colonies. So the diagram that Ale de la Puente and I made in Baja California, it was part of a geopolitical mapping project. Next, please. These were our inscription tools. We basically had what we had at hand. And this is part of following the instructions. You makers of the diagram needed to build a flat surface, erect a stylus, and have very simple inscription tools so that they could register the shadow that the sun would cast through with the stylus over two concentric circles. Next, please. So most of the day, what we did was to follow a shadow over these two concentric circles. And this means that 2 paragraphs of the instructions actually last in an embodied experience about 12 hours. Next, please. So basically, we followed the shadows of the moon with a shell, which gave us a perpendicular angle. And at the end of the day, next, please, we had lines, circles, lines, and dots that were the preparation of this diagram that we then erected on the sand and that during the lunar eclipse needed to receive the light from the moon. What I want to talk about today is not really the information, the mathematical information that is carried in the diagram, but about the invisible labor and discipline that is needed in the making. So this process that we carried out was also replicated by 60 students in San Diego, in San Francisco, in China. And if we were the 16th century cosmographer, we would have drawn all the diagrams together and compare the shadows and make calculations for the establishment of longitude in these different points. What we actually did was focus on the process of making the lines, of following the shadows, and of observing the lunar eclipse. So what I want to say here is that in a diagram such as this one, the information about experience is silenced. And I will stop there for now.
Thank you. Now let me spotlight Trevor.
Hey, hello. Thank you to Natalie and Elizabeth for organizing this wonderful panel. Thanks to Nydia and Mimi. So I'm going to start my timer to make sure I stick to a very rigid schedule. My topic today is a graphic score for musical performance composed between 1963 and 67 by the British composer Cornelius Cardew. In fact, Cardew's birthday, I found out, is tomorrow, so it's somewhat timely if you care at all about these sorts of things. To begin with, I'll say that from a certain point of view, all musical scores are diagrams of a sort. They are schematized means for presenting and storing information. They fix in a very particular language numerous facts and relations of sound and of bodies. What instruments and in what relation to one another, the character of individual sounds from pitch to dynamics, the shape of time itself in terms of time signature and tempo, as well as more diffuse compositional intentions. And above all, musical scores are meant to be repeatable. Natalie, could you advance the slide, please? Cardew's score, on that hand, is unusual on several fronts. It presents a complex and ever-changing linear composition, which moves from left to right across 193 pages. It deploys wide open space, as well as dense graphic activity in equal measure. It incorporates abstract form as much as recognizable symbolic information in terms of numerals and musical notation of a pseudo-traditional sort. So on the one hand, treatise is in fact one of the longest, one of the biggest graphic scores in musical history. It's still performed today. I just watched a performance from 2020 by some incredible Irish musicians. But on the other hand, it's not the first graphic score of its sort. In fact, those of you who are interested can read a chapter in Natalie Haren's book about the history of graphic scores. And in fact, what I want to emphasize, so it's not the first, it might be the biggest, who knows, but I want to emphasize that this is a score that's about the contradictions of the score as a form of diagrammatic notation. Cardew himself described the treatise, this score, as a form of diagrammatic writing. Cardew emerged, or this score rather, emerged from a break with Cardew's musical training and musical expertise. He was one of the most important and one of the most devoted students of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the very important post-serialist composer who studied with Stockhausen in the 50s in Cologne and Darmstadt. He knew this form of notation that Stockhausen developed so well that Stockhausen said Cardew could find errors in his own scores that he had missed. But Cardew began to resist what he saw as an extraordinary form of discipline exerted upon musical performers by the score and by the composer. It took the form of the extraordinary complexity and demands on performers that Stockhausen's scores involved. Stockhausen once said that he preferred working with electronics at a certain stage in his career or composing for electronic instruments, because you didn't need to involve a computer in conversation for an hour about the meaning of modern music before they would emit a single note. So this is the kind of discipline that Cardew was working with. And so this score was a means to break with that kind of discipline. Again, he said it was a diagram. So what kind of diagram is it? In some ways, it's an empty diagram. Natalie, could you advance, please? I mean that it's emptiness in that it does not represent any pre-existing sonic character, and it doesn't represent any pre-existing or fixed sonic intentions, and nor does it generate any repeatable results, or is it intended to generate repeatable results. Cardew instead insisted, quote, "The sound should be a picture of the score and not vice versa." So the score, the performance of treatise represents the score rather than the score representing a intended sonic set of relations. Cardew said, quote, "Interpreter, remember that no meaning is as yet attached to the symbols." And so the score, paradoxically, or not paradoxically, the score, Cardew insisted ever more on the score's authority. He said that the score must govern the music. It must have authority and not be a merely arbitrary jumping off point for improvisation. So this contradiction then between extreme openness, that the score could generate sound of almost any character, but then also that the score has to have authority over the performance. This contradiction was key to treatise. What does a performance look like in practice? Well, if you're curious, there are many great recordings of this piece. Unfortunately, of course, I can't play. But just to describe, as a spur to interpretation, that would be very rule bound still. The score the interpreter has to basically generate the rules for interpretation out of the score itself. So for example, one performance took any square shape to indicate the hitting of a gong, any circle to indicate the playing with a radio, and any form that enclosed lines to indicate a preparation to be placed on the strings of a piano. Another indicated that whenever numbers appear in the score, or interpreted numbers as they came out in the score to indicate repeated, the repetition number and the length of a randomly chosen chord. And Cardew himself performed a version where whenever a number came up in the score, he would pause and listen for ambient environmental sounds until he heard the number prescribed in the score. So finally, this score, you could see it as a tool for undoing hierarchies in terms of Cardew's intentions. Hierarchies of the composer over the score and over the sound, the hierarchy of the score over the performers, and finally of trained musicians over non-musicians. Treatise was intended to be equally interpretable, equally successfully interpretable by non-musicians as by trained musicians. Natalie, could you advance the last slide, please? And so this led into two different directions for Cardew initially. First, to abandon the score form completely. He said that he is now being led beyond problems of notation to the question of a musical life. And so this took the form of free improvisation, a practice of free improvisation, especially with the group AMM, whose record AMM Music is an absolute classic, who I'd recommend everyone listen to. And then the other direction was the founding of what he called the Scratch Orchestra in 1969, where this extremely complex still graphic notation form transitions into extremely simple text-based instructions most frequently, similar to what the Fluxus movement was doing more broadly. So one example is a score by Cardew in 1969 read simply, pretend to play, pretend not to play. And that's the entirety of the score. And then the final stage of Cardew's life is to take this attack on the hierarchy of intellectual and manual labor to a point where he devoted his life to full-time activism as a member of a sort of fringe Maoist sect in the UK, where he devoted himself to, where he abandoned avant-garde music and devoted himself to people's music, as he put it, that would serve the people, a model with extraordinary contradictions that maybe I'll have time to talk about in the discussion. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Trevor. I would like to hand it over lastly to Mimi Gelman.
Thank you, Natalie and Elizabeth, and to my esteemed colleagues, Nydia and Trevor. I'm delighted to be joining you today from the unceded ancestral territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I state this to suggest my reciprocity, responsibilities, and commitments to the land that I now call my home. And of course, it is the city of Vancouver. So the German theoretical physicist Max Planck stated that, quote, modern physics has taught us that the nature of any system cannot be discovered by dividing it into its component parts and studying each part by itself, but rather we must keep our attention fixed on the whole and on the interconnection between the parts. The same is true of our intellectual life. It is impossible to make a clear cut between science, religion, and art. The whole is never equal simply to the sum of its various parts. So today I'm going to talk about the importance of creative visualizations across disciplinary boundaries and the implications of language and worldviews. I'm particularly interested in the way that diagrams can help us to further and deepen the intrinsic connections between art making, aesthetics, storytelling, and especially drawing as thinking in the development of complex scientific visualization, and also in the transmission of what I call unmediated knowledge. I'm also interested in the non-binary and in resonances between Indigenous knowledge and physics, and between traditional ways of considering cognition and thinking with the hand. I will also be touching briefly on the notion of diagrams that are mutable objects, rather than as Latour's immutable mobiles. So in talking about thinking with the hand, I'm positioning drawing as a way of coming to know. And what I'm pointing to here is a certain kind of behavior, one that involves and integrates bodies, materials, and cognition. As the designer Nigel Cross articulates so well, quote, "What most designers and artists do is to draw and redraw lines, shapes, and objects, fuzzy stuff, until they can read in or off what has been drawn something useful. We call this operation interactive imagery, the simultaneous or almost simultaneous production of a display and the generation of an image that it triggers. Sketching, then, is not merely an act of representation of a pre-formulated image, but rather in the context we deal with, it is, or often or not, a search for such an image," end quote. The drawings that you're looking at arose out of collaboration in an extraordinary 4-year research project led by my esteemed colleagues Ingrid Koenig and Randy Cutler from Emily Carr University. The project was entitled Leaning Out of Windows, and it explored the nature of reality through interdisciplinary investigations and encounters between Emily Carr University's faculty, art students, and visiting artists, physicists, postdoctoral researchers, and graduate students working at Triumph, Canada's Particle Accelerator Center at the University of British Columbia. The exploration with my designated physicist, Brian Coote, investigated the realm of antimatter, and through engaging in deep conversations that ranged from the Big Bang to matter and antimatter to aesthetics, and finally to metaphysics and spirituality, I came to understand that we shared notions between us about creativity and the poetics of associative thinking, and that we were both passionately committed to the exploration of the unknown. I came to understand that we were both lateral thinkers, comfortable in that place of unknowing and very appreciative of the realm of ambiguity. I contend that both contemporary physics and contemporary art are about interiority, the interior dimension explored in subatomic physics, and the implicit interiority of contemporary art are no longer only about the representation of the external world and what is visible, but rather about exploring the architecture of consciousness and the material and immaterial nature of our worlds. I consider these diagrams or these drawings as diagrams of metaphysical kinships that gather and marry dialogic memories and scientific data with Ojibwe beating patterns and Ojibwe sacred beings. They are drawings that reflect a coming together of seemingly disparate worldviews, and in effect are mere manifestations of different dialects and different ontological perspectives. In a previous discussion about this work, I suggested that these drawings communicated unmediated knowledge, and this seemed to perplex my colleagues, given that drawing is generally considered to be a discipline that mediates ideas, allowing us to grasp through visualizations certain kinds of understandings. To explain my position, I turn to the words of the curator Kit Hammonds, who explained when talking about the artist James Turrell and his light installations that his work allowed, quote, affect to overrule thought, and that it enabled us to pass into new perceptions and understandings of our own place and time. And I would suggest that these understandings are felt through the haptic, through the sum total of our senses. In Arthur C. Danto's book, Embodied Meanings, Danto refers to artists who strive to involve their audiences in a relationship that is more intimate than vision alone permits. Danto states, quote, but for the period in which the relationship between the individual and the work endures, and independently of whether it is internalized in any further sense, the viewer embodies the meaning the work confers, end quote. I would also suggest that the artwork assumes, through its very essence, its materiality, the explicit shape required of it to confer its meaning. Danto refers to such works as those that transform the viewers unto other planes as celebrants and as metaphorical participants in a larger spiritual transaction. So in this panel, my colleagues have referred to Bruno Latour's seminal essay entitled Visualization and Cognition, Drawing Things Together, which I just read this week, by the way. I found it really productive in thinking about how diagrams arise and also what diagrams do. The term immutable mobiles that Latour coined has been invoked many times, and I'm intrigued by the notion that suggests particular qualities and characteristics of these objects whose forms and functions remain stable across different contexts and places. In particular, he suggests that consistency is the key in order to communicate and convey understandings, and that these visualizations must have elements of optical consistency, consistency being key, such as perspective, and that these objects should be consistent with the visual culture at the time that the visualization was created. Completely agree there. But what if the world that created these drawings, these diagrams, is a different world altogether? One which does not recognize the separation between constituent elements of the universe, but rather one that is made up of animate forces and qualities that are contingent and relational and always in flux. So the diagrams and drawings that are presented here today operate, I'm suggesting they operate in a different realm. They are mutable objects, partial, individual, relational, and dependent on an array of disparate ontologies. The late quantum physicist David Peat noted in his book, Blackfoot Physics, that the indigenous symbol transcends the sign as a living embodiment of the teachings. That, quote, he says, within indigenous science, a particular symbol is not an abstraction or a reflection of reality that a model within Western science is, but rather it is something that permits direct connection with the energies, spirits, and animating power of nature. He says, there is, in a sense, that like a holograph, a symbol, there is the sense that like a holograph, a symbol, an object can unfold the whole of reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mimi. I'd like to bring every one of the panelists back together now. Do you all prefer that I keep the slides handy in case we want to go back to them?
Sure, but I think we probably will. I mean, it will depend on, obviously, on the audience and on the panel. I'm good with that.
Okay.
As long
I'll
as you
keep
can
them
see
up.
each other's faces.
Yes, good. I tried to spotlight everyone. I think y'all are there. I just wanted again to invite folks to pop questions, observations in the chat. We certainly don't intend to be the 5 talking heads in the room. But I'll just dive right in with some gathering questions and almost impossibly diverse range of perspectives on the diagram, but this is precisely why Elizabeth and I were really interested in getting you all in the virtual room together. So thank you so much. I mean, one of the ways to sort of tackle this problem, I would say, of the diagram might be to begin with thinking about, in each of your case studies, the relationship of the diagram to its referent. It's a very complicated relationship, and I think you know, in diagram studies we often think we know what a diagram is until we get into these deep case studies and we begin to understand that the relationship of the diagram to its referent is much more complicated than, you know, what we have at face value. And this beginning to think about its relation to its reference can get us to start thinking about the way the diagram marries textuality and visuality. It marries the abstract and the material. And for me, one of the ways, you know, the kind of foundational ways to begin thinking about this is going back to C.S. Peirce's notion of you know, trying to categorize what a diagram is. And he talks about it as an operational icon. So something that looks like what it represents, but again, is kind of abstracted and structural and meant as a kind of tool. So to kind of circle back to my opening gambit, I was wondering if each of you could reflect a bit more on the relationship of the diagram you presented to its referent and your thinking around that relationship.
So I'd be happy to start.
Thank you.
So in my case, the ideal referent is the notation of changes of time over space. That's what changing shadows represent. In an ideal circuit of communication where everybody in that circuit shares the same language, which here would be spherical geometry, and the same context for the interpretation of that language, then we could say, yeah, they agree on ways of recording time over space. The problem is translation, and not just translation in terms of perceptual translation, how we experience changes of light, how our bodies react, the timing in which we do it, and how that can differ in a wide range of people and places. But there's also specifically in my case, the translation of instructions is extremely, extremely difficult. And this is something that was very surprising in the process of enacting them. They were created using a simplified Spanish of the 16th century. No mathematical language is used at all. Yet, it is extremely difficult to find punctuation, to understand precisely the timings that are expected, the attention spans that are expected to be represented. Anyway, so the referents aren't clear at all in the final notations. And another thing that interests me as a historian of science is that ultimately the referent that I'm interested in, so the signifier that I would be interested in unearthing, is the relationship between space, time, environment, and body. And that isn't registered in lines over circles. So thank you. I hope that was clear.
Well, it's interesting in your case because the diagram is produced out of an interpretation of the text. So in a sense, the text is the referent of the diagram. But what I really like about your approach is that you're trying to, in your reading, you open up a space for labor to be a referent of the diagram or time to be a referent of the diagram. So it's wonderful, yeah.
I would say there are different stages in the making of the referent. So the first referent is the text, and then the diagram that is made by reading the instructions would then become a referent for the interpreter. And that's the referent that I think is also, it's equally ambiguous. The instructions and the result.
Do you mind if I hop in? Because what Nidia just said sounds extremely relevant to Cardou's graphic score, where the relations of, or the status of the referent is completely unstable. It could be said it's almost upside down as a sign of some sort. So thinking out loud, I guess, in a traditional score, the referent and the sign are basically co-constituted. They're built at the same time when a composer is writing a score. The composition comes to be through the writing of the symbolic notation. After that, the referent, I suppose, is the composition, the combination of sounds that exist in some sort of an idealized state in relation to the composer's intentions, and that later musicians who play the score are trying depending on how faithful the musician is, are trying to get at something like a faithful reproduction of the referent, which is the sonic relations that the composer intended. Cardou, it's absolutely, again, as I said, kind of upside down. The referent is the score. the music that is then played is some sort of a relation. The musical performance that interprets the score is an interpretation of a referent, right? So rather than a score which has a kind of idea of what the sound should be, that is the referent that the score tries to symbolically capture, with Cardew, the score it simply is like an object in the world, like an image that then people construct symbolic relations to through performance, right? So in theory for Cardew, that would allow basically every interpreter to be a composer as well, as the interpreter comes up with systems of rules, systems of interpretation, decides on the meaning of marks. That again, as he said, the meaning is not fixed in advance, right? So I guess that's what I would say.
Well, I'm going to jump in here. And so a couple of things have arisen for me. One is paradox that everyone seems to have spoken to, and the other, this question of ambiguity. And so, and this question of a state of flux. So Trevor was talking about, this back and forth between the score as it was written, the interpretation of the score, the way that sort of maybe the way that Deleuze and Guattari or Heidegger might have a lexicon. Each of these composers or musicians would attribute a certain kind of lexicon, right? The square means this, so that fascinates me. That completely fascinates me, and of course brings me back to think, that that one would have to be so open when one does a score like that to multiplicity in any kind of outcome, right? So I love that. In these drawings, I think about, they're all about dynamic life forces. They really are, in many ways, a kind of notation of not only conversations, but things that arose after. So Nydia talked about sort of this crossing of time. These are also over time. And because of their nature, I mean, I can point to, for example, Dirac, in the center one, Dirac's formula that helped to situate the existence of antimatter. But it sits within a floating field of other kinds of relations. And so I feel that in this case, these diagrams can't rely on pre-existing understanding across a diverse audience, that a scientist would read them in a particular way. They might look at the one on the right and say, I understand what that is. That's annihilation. That's when a positive and negative particle annihilate. Or an Ojibwe elder might look at these and say, I recognize that figure on the left as being the bear that is the gatekeeper of a particular doorway. And so I would say that in terms of that these are there are reference here, but that they operate more mnemonically, so that one might be able to sit with one of these drawings and some kind of an experience of being in the world, some kind of phenomenological experience might arise out of the gestalt, but the wholeness of these diagrams.
One of the things that has struck me in what everyone has been saying, and I'm not sure that it's applicable to the entire corpus of diagrams that exist in the world, but particularly to the objects and practices that we've been talking about here today, is the degree to which the diagram is a reciprocal arrangement in which it is produced by, but also produces a sort of knowing subject. And that in contrast to Pierce's idea of the diagram as an operational icon, the diagrams we've been talking about here, they are indexical as well as iconic and symbolic, and there's this constant sort of push and pull back and forth across the surface of the diagram, between the surface of the diagram and the maker, that renders the idea of a referent actually kind of problematic. That it's the more the sort of operational aspect that, rather than the iconic aspect, that I relate to in that categorization.
This came up in our preparatory conversation. Trevor, you kind of brought up the fact that the diagram has like sort of two dimensions to it, which is something that I've been working on via a text that I'm writing about, like the temporality of diagrams, and thinking about these sort of two functions or two relationships of time that they have. And you said, you sort of observed that the diagram can have this sort of this like preservative function, a function of registration, or it can have this function of like generativity or even discovery. I'm wondering if you wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that kind of strikes me as a good kind of working definition of what kind of things a diagram can do more generally. I guess, suppose Latour would agree that the diagram allows for the registration, the preservation, the sharing, the immutability of kinds of knowledge that then become a bit able through the diagram to be, to be read, combined, interpreted, etc. And then, yeah, that second part, the generativity. I mean, at Cardew's, I guess this is in the Peirce definition too, the operational nature of the diagram. Diagrams asked to be used, right? Not just to be abstractly contemplated like a work of art. And so Cardew's intervention, I suppose, is basically to shift the focus or the emphasis almost totally toward the generativity and leave open pretty consciously any possible interpretation would have some sort of equal validity. Yeah, and again, it has proven very generative, and if your barometer is the number of times it's been interpreted. Natalie, you might have counter examples, but for me, I know of no other graphic score that's been performed and recorded quite so many times by so many pretty extraordinary musicians. So anyway, I'll stop there. But possibly the categories might even be more useful for others, since mine is really, it's a counter diagram in a way. It's really not operating the way diagram should.
I was wondering, Elizabeth, how this relates in your work to the experience of the students like learning how to, like, they're sort of the agents, they're making diagrams, but they're also sort of like learning about how diagrams function, or a certain kind of mode of diagrammatic visualization works through the process of making them. So there's this kind of like disciplining that's happening. They're not necessarily making the diagrams to I don't know, survey the world, but really kind of be disciplined in the operations of diagram making. And I'm wondering how that relates to the comment that you just made.
So as part of the larger project that diagram comes from, I kind of trace the training aspect into sort of an engagement out with the real world, and the way in which the tools and techniques and skills acquired through that drawing process and the kind of the disciplining of the body and sort of shaping of habits of body and mind kind of resonates into their work as surveyors and military officers. And actually, Trevor, I want to talk to you about, and actually talk to all of you about the diagram as an instrument to destroy hierarchy. Because I think it's run so counter to Latour's definition of kind of accruing power. But one of the things I've really started to think about is the matter of taste, and something I feel like we don't talk about a lot when it comes to diagrams, but the way the sort of precision and micromanagement of observation and sort of application of the hand is specifically understood to develop the taste of the engineer. And engineering is not something you think of as needing taste, but that it's the practice of drawing and the practice of diagram making is kind of shaping again sort of discernment of the eye and the taste of the maker, so that it can later be deployed in the arrangement of space and the design of objects. So while the motions are sort of carefully prescribed through exercises written out very much like Nydia's instructions, they then, the idea is that they will kind of proliferate and germinate future ideas and possibilities. Which actually had me thinking, Trevor, about the way the reading of the Cardew score would have to be informed by all of the other diagrams and scores and materials that a musician had ever encountered, right? That it's not a standalone object. And sort of how does that fit into Cardew's understanding of hierarchy and experience and expertise?
Yeah, thank you. I guess it works in two ways, because it was intended to be playable by anyone. Whether that is the truth or not, of course, is something else. And I just said a minute ago, it's been performed by basically virtuoso free improvisers and virtuoso avant-garde musicians, basically ever since it was written, as a kind of a testing ground, really, for one's capabilities and capacities as a musician. So on the one hand, it can be a springboard for extraordinary demonstrations of skill, creativity, innovation. But for Cardew, that was extremely problematic. That would be, if it was only that would be a problem, right? And so the idea was too, that in fact, parts of the score that look most like traditional notation, there are notes scattered throughout, they are stripped completely of any way that a trained musician would have to interpret them typically, right? And so they're almost like traps. Like the trained musician sees them and thinks, oh, okay, here's some notation, here's a time signature, I can kind of do this, but it'll defeat the attempts to interpret every time. And so he intended it to be playable by non-musicians, and he worked it out. He taught experimental music night courses at a kind of a working class technical college in England, where he would lead collective improvisations. Where one example is have dried beans on a plate, where that was your instrument, and you roll the dried beans on the plate in order to generate sound following the score, right? But ultimately, he began to feel that the score was a kind of vestige of a bourgeois musical culture that ultimately had, as he would have put it in his Maoist mode, no relation to the advancement of the cause of the global proletariat. And so he basically put a hard stop to it all.
This might be a good point at which to bring in a question in the chat from Abanadi Meza, one of my colleagues here in the School of Art, that I think might be able to loop me back into the conversation. Does anyone have thoughts on how diagrams are also kind of blinding machines? By mapping a limited relationship or number of relationships to its referent, a diagram can kind of obscure multidimensional realities by constructing a translation. I'm not thinking so much about the examples you all have presented on here, but maybe other kinds of diagrams of plants, animals, human anatomy, maps, etc. Is there something like a counter diagram?
That's an amazing question, and it's a question that I hope that you can send to us, Natalie, so we can continue to ponder that more deeply than this moment allows. I'm thinking about I'm going back to Latour's essay, and all the ways that it describes what diagrams do or how they were implicated, for example, in imperialism and colonization, and the idea about that the diagram had to have these characteristics because it needed to be brought back to make a case for something. So it had to have these very, very specific consistencies. And I'm just trying to think. I might have just lost my my train here. Oh yes, and so So speaking to that, I had a couple of cringeworthy moments in reading this essay, and this one on, I think, page 15 of the essay, where he's quoting Fabian, and he says, "An asymmetry is created because we create a space and a time in which we place the other cultures, but they do not do the same. For instance, we map their land, but they have no maps either of their land or of ours. We list their past, but they do not. We build calendars, they do not." And so, like I was cringing in that, at reading in that, because some of the most extraordinary maps that exist today, when considering them within the post-1987 definition of a map, is that maps are also embodied artifacts. And some of the most sophisticated maps that exist today could not have been read as maps by disciplinary cartographers. They didn't know how to see or how to look at these maps. And an example might be the stick maps of the oceans that oceanic peoples create, that are extraordinary. But here's the key: they require embodied knowledge. So they're not those kinds of transcriptions that can be read like a disciplinary map. And Diana Taylor, I pulled a quote from her that she writes in the book, The Archive and the Repertoire. She says that the repertoire enacts embodied memory. So she says, "The telling is important as the writing. The doing is central as the recording. Memory passed down through bodies and mnemonic processes." So what changed with conquest was not that writing, and I would say also drawing of a certain kind, displaced embodied practices, but the degree of legitimization of writing over other epistemic and mnemonic systems. And so that's what I think is so interesting around this this realm of the diagram and the epistemological and ontological perspectives that that one has in order to engage with them or not.
Thank you so much for bringing in the Diana Taylor and those thoughts. It's really reminding me how easy it is to fetishize the diagram as this autonomous, operational icon or what have you. But really, I mean, one referent of any diagram is the creator of the diagram, and the other sort of referent, that a future referent is the interpreter. And that makes me think back to Nydia, your presentation and your project, which makes perhaps the most radical, daring leap by trying to re-embody a very old diagram. So can you say a little bit more about the process of trying to like revivify the embodied interpreter of that?
Yeah, of course. And I can talk about the fetish of the diagram as well. And I was, can we go back to one of the photos where we can see the sand? Yeah, there. So when I read in the chat, is there a counter diagram? So I would say the counter diagram is all the space that's around that flat surface that we're trying to measure. And it's everything that is not contained in the notation. And it's everything that I learned from following the instructions. Okay, the instructions are about finding the meridian. So finding a really simple line that anybody who lives in the place can tell you from their daily experience. Where does the sun rise and where does the sun set? That gives you just, you know, your east and west, and then that way you can find your north and your south. And it's really interesting that a cosmographer in Spain needed to send instructions to make a very abstract diagram to obtain information that people in place could have just basically given without needing to follow these instructions. And actually the instructions didn't even work. I mean, he didn't, there was one cosmographer in duty throughout like these 20 years when these were being circulated. And so it was not a successful project. Basically, what came out of the instructions were unsuccessful diagrams in terms of mathematical information. And that's something that's known, but in the process of following them, of finding that it's actually extremely boring to just follow a shadow, draw some, you know, some marks on a flat surface. What's interesting actually is everything that happens around. So the changes in the daylight, the animals that appear, the people that circulate, and the micro power relations that can be, that just arise in who makes the mark, who brings the food, who is in charge of providing the materials. So if I had to say it like really simply, what I learned was that everything but the diagram is what matters.
Yeah, this reminds me of the book by Bender and Marinin, The Culture of Diagram, where they spend a lot of time talking about all of the empty space around the diagram, which is an analog to some of the things that you were just describing. I do love in your project, Nydia, how you help us see that diagrams are not they don't have to be like two-dimensional things that sit on a page necessarily, that it's really helpful to think of a diagram as something like a set of relationships. You know, what happens if we think of an immutable mobile as like really a physical object. I'm wondering if we could maybe zoom out even a little bit more and hear from you all about why diagrams, you know, like what does using diagrams as an entry point to understand human culture, like what does that give us in terms of a set of understandings of the historical period that we're looking at, or certain, you know, cultural geography? Yeah, I'm curious what is bringing you to this material, and how would you argue that it helps us understand your area better?
I think for me, it's, you know, I'm going back to Avenatti's question. And I'll be thinking about that a lot. This idea of a counter diagram and the ways that particular disciplines create limits or boundaries in terms of categorizations or classifications. And so in and I consider that very helpful in order to situate a particular discipline or a particular idea as represented in a drawing. I think for me, my diagrams are not necessarily meant to explicate. So they're sort of meant to create a field within which multiple dimensions, perhaps even contradictory or paradoxical ideas can be simultaneously held up at the same time. So again, speaking about this binary. So that's what I would say, that for me, diagrams, my diagrams or my involvement with diagrams help me to put forward this idea of seemingly contradictory concepts existing simultaneously.
Okay, I'll jump in. I suppose I'm possibly a rather conservative disciplinary art historian, insofar that diagrams are not, for me, the object of my study so much as diagrams insofar as they enter into the work of art. And I think for me, the text that shaped how I think about diagrams and their role in my very narrow parochial subfield of 20th century avant-garde art history is Molly Nesbitt's Their Common Sense, where she showed how the most, seemingly abstracted and conceptual forms of art making in the early 20th century, like Cubism and certain practices of Dadaists like Marcel Duchamp, Francis Picabia, related very directly to the most practical, technical drawing, in sort of the sort of thing that actually Elizabeth showed in her presentation, and that these artists were returning in some ways to the instructional drawing lessons that they had in their school years, and also drawing from and subverting technical drawings like schematics, for like in Francis Picabia's case, mechanical schemata, and they did so in a way as if they thought to themselves, what forms of drawing exist that are the furthest possible from the fine arts? Drawings that are extraordinarily complex and developed, etc., but that are not artistic. They are non-art. And that's where you start, right? And so you use diagrams in this way to push the work of art out of its comfort zone. And that entails, in theory at least, a kind of attack on certain hierarchies and social distributions of skill, social distributions of qualities like genius upon certain kinds of intellectual work, as opposed to certain kinds of practical knowing and forms of making. And so that is where I'm coming at it from. The diagram, I guess, is the form of rationalization, under a word that Bruno Latour wouldn't want us to say, capitalism. That is the social totality under which we all live. So these artists were taking the most practical forms that make capitalism run and making it not run quite so well.
Are you muted, Elizabeth?
He gets to capitalism at the end, but money, like
Only
a
to
diagram,
say it's not so important.
money, like a diagram, is an immutable mobile, and so it just falls under the
Yeah.
larger rubric. It's funny that you mentioned the Molly Nesbitt book, Trevor, because I think for me, I was asked about that text actually at a job interview not too long ago, and as a way of asking me to find sort of long-term kind of art historical endpoint for my study of the diagram in the 19th century. And in retrospect, I didn't answer that question the way I should have, but I'm going to do it now. Because I actually am not interested in sort of what the diagram became as it was adopted or assimilated into fine art, right? But the way in which diagrammatic practice is a form of visual culture and material making that was actually far more widespread in early America than fine art practice, and is therefore a way of looking at discourse around visuality and representation and reference and all of the things that we have been talking about today, and sort of locating a really sophisticated discussion of what it means to abstract the world into the two-dimensional image in a place that where that discourse is conventionally understood to be lacking, because we don't have in the United States sort of several centuries of sort of formal art education and academic practice. And so now, for me, it's really a polemical issue of sort of trying to assert technical drawing as a place where we really need to interrogate those questions. And actually, I might sort of jump into the chat a little bit, because there's this interesting question from Mary Yacoub about what knowledge or possibilities might be lost by architects or engineers who no longer have the same gestural relationship to the making of diagrams as they have moved from a paper-based to a digital age. Do you think artists or others have a role in reviving or drawing attention to knowledge acquired through making? And again, I think that's kind of related to this issue where we have a tendency to fetishize the gesturality of fine art drawing. And one of the things I've been trying to do is kind of locate that, the presence of gesture and the sort of reciprocal relationship between artist and page in this more technical field. But it's also one of the reasons why I have pursued this line of research, because I trained as an architect kind of at the moment where we were shifting from manual drafting to computer drafting. And I'm interested in sort of what is gained and lost. And my short answer would be, we have, one of the things I've discovered in this research is the act of drawing is always a technologically mediated one. And the tools and strategies of drawing are not, it's not a direct and unmediated practice ever. Sorry, Mimi.
Oh no, that's okay. You know, I mean, it's you know, these perspectives are really interesting for me. And I looked at that question as well, and I was thinking, you know, I had an argument with or a discussion with one of my colleagues in the design program at Emily Carr University, talking about, you know, what I hold dear and what are those skills that I think that all our students have to have. And I said, well, they need to learn how to draw. She goes, no. We no longer really need that. We have programs and SketchUp or whatever, you know, even more sophisticated, obviously, CAD programs to help our students conceptualize space. But that's where I disagreed, is that this idea of what drawing does and the way drawings speak back to you as a form of knowledge acquisition, that there's something that occasions that happens when one is using the hand, and this is, many people have written about Nigel Cross, who I quoted, thinking with the hand. It's a very, very different type of activity than working through a computer program. And that understanding of spatiality that we contain as walking phenomenological beings comes out, I think, more cogently, more truthfully through this hand-eye or heart-hand, or through all the ways that our beings operate. It allows for a very, very different kind of conceptualization dependent on the technology used. So I would agree with you there in terms of technology, but I am not sure that I don't know. I won't argue that, Elizabeth, because I want to think about it more deeply in terms of this question of, because it does make sense to me on many levels that this drawing that now exists in the world mediates, right, something. And I guess what I am thinking through is this idea of knowledge that is communicated through a gestalt, through a kind of haptic resonance that is not only visual, but that can also be a mediation. So I'll concur there.
We are meant to wrap up around 30 minutes past the hour. I wanted to open a space for Nydia to dive into this portion of the conversation.
Thank you. I was just thinking, but by these recent remarks, about the people who would have followed the instructions in the 16th century without being experts, without understanding what they were doing, just by making physical marks in response to an instruction. In a way, I am also, that kind of non-skilled, non-expert. And in relation to what Mimi was saying, I do think that recovering, and I think Elizabeth is saying this too, that in the gesture, there's discipline, regardless or not whether there is skill, but there's discipline in terms of concentration, in terms of relationship with the task, the place, the present. And that is also a fully emotional, affective experience. So I think there is a place where very strictly codified diagrams and less ruled diagrams or forms of drawing or forms of making lines contain this affect, and ultimately I think the marks are re-signified over time. I think the meaning does come over time, and I think that would connect with Trevor. They're always performative gestures, and they are always receiving. They're forms of knowledge that always create forms of knowledge and always create and receive new meaning. That's what I was thinking as.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've begun to think about what you're mentioning, Nydia, in my subfield of the 1960s, sort of parallel to what Trevor was speaking about as a form of tacit knowledge, which is sort of also a joke nodding towards John Cage's silent piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, because of course tacit is also how you reference silence in music, but there's also tacit, T-A-C-I-T, knowledge around how to interpret a score that is embodied, and it can get lost, or it can change. So I, for one, have a very difficult time accepting any idea that a diagram is immutable, or at least maybe the diagrams I'm most interested in are the ones that are the least immutable. And I tend towards a more sort of Deleuzian approach to thinking about diagrams. But does anyone have any more that they just like, they want to get into the conversation before we wrap up?
I want to make sure we've had a few questions in the chat, and I think we've kind of been dancing around Emily Capper and Benjamin Kozlowski's questions about hierarchy and kind of the failure of the diagram. I think is an interesting, a failure of the diagram to live up to its ideals. And I wanted to make sure we got a chance to address those.
And also Claire Scanlon brings up this idea that the diagram might provide an exit from the hegemonic model of contemporary art as we know it, which I think we've also been circling a bit around in terms of thinking about diagrams as, in some cases, anti-disciplinary objects. They invite us to read them kind of, yeah, through multiple lenses. Well, in that case, I am going to put my email back in the chat. So in case any of the folks who did ask questions in the chat would like to be put in touch with the panelists, presuming the panelists are willing, we can kind of continue this conversation off screen. And Elizabeth and I just extend our deepest thanks to our panelists, Mimi, Nydia, Trevor, and also to the audience who have almost all stuck with us this whole time. So much appreciation. If you want to relive our hour and a half together, please visit the RBS YouTube channel in a couple days or weeks, and the video should be posted there. And I wish everyone a happy weekend, happy spring, happy summer.